All right, cool. Welcome to the channel. So today I'm talking with Fatum. I'm going to call him a Spenglerian expert on the internet, where we will hopefully discuss a little bit about Spengler in the modern times, how it relates to Germany and some political Prussianism, and what exactly we can think about when we interact politics in the modern age with Spengler. So I don't know if you want to give a background intro, Fatum, on yourself, or a little bit of dialogue.
Well, I started reading Spengler relatively early in my, I guess you could say, political journey. I don't know, 17, 18. I started getting interested in politics around that age, and relatively early, I picked up Spengler. Interestingly enough, interesting or funnily enough, I started out with the typical Ben Shapiro destroy social justice warrior,
of course.
and that kind of stuff, which I think is usual for our generation.
Yeah.
But sure. I quickly became uninterested in that because it was very shallow, I think. And I started, frequenting the usual places, Twitter, 4chan, whatever. And eventually I stumbled across Spengler. I heard about him previously, just, mentioned. And then I was like, oh, whatever, I'll just buy some of his books. And I ordered, I think, all of his books at once.
Oh, nice.
And I started out reading with Man and Technics, I think it's called in English.
Yep.
Which I do recommend for anyone who's not read Spengler as the first book, because it's in German, it's like 50 pages. I don't know how many it is in English.
Yeah, about the same. I think 62 or something. Yeah.
And you really get to know his writing style, the way he phrases his thoughts very well, I think, in a short format. And, if you start out reading The Decline of the West, it can kind of hit you over the head. It's a bit much at the start, I think.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, it's very confronting work if you're not used to particularly long philosophical works, because is it 600 pages? It's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, in German, the complete thing is like 1,000.
Yeah, okay.
200, both volumes.
Yep.
But
with the notes, obviously.
Yeah, with the notes, with the recommended authors.
Yeah.
Which are interesting to go through, by the way. If you ever want to delve deeper into Spengler's thoughts, just go through the recommended authors, pick one at random, and look him up, and then maybe buy a book or just read articles about the guy. And these are very interesting people generally that he recommends to read.
Yeah, no, I fully agree.
But anyway, I started with Man and Technics, and I think I read Prussianism and Socialism next, and I actually read Decline, not the first, but the third or the fourth book that I read of him.
Okay. And now correct me if I'm wrong, but Prussianism and Socialism, was it built off the back of Decline of the West? It was written prior. There was some interaction with Decline of the West, isn't there?
Well, it was published, I think, 1924. I might have gotten this wrong. I don't remember the dates particularly well. But as far as I know, it is sort of a collection of all of his political thoughts that he didn't really put into The Decline of the West. He had some notes in there, or some parts of The Decline of the West, that if you read it, you can, this is basically what he says in Prussianism and Socialism.
Yeah.
But in a more philosophical light in Decline of the West.
Yeah.
Or a more historical version, I guess.
Yep, that makes more sense.
Interestingly enough, he wanted to call his, what was it called? Decline of the West, the original title that he came up with 1910 or something like that was Conservatism and Liberalism, something like that. And
I'm glad he didn't go with that, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no, it doesn't sound as good.
No.
But he, so this was supposed to be a more political book at the beginning. But I guess those political thoughts essentially get distilled into Prussianism and Socialism later on then.
Yes, I think Spengler's actually probably one of the best authors in terms of writing philosophically, but then in his applied works, still writing with the same amount of artistic, poetic merit. It's super nice.
Yes, I agree.
So and then you read Decline of the West after Prussianism, Socialism then?
Yeah, I think so. And then somewhere in that I don't remember the exact chronology,
Yeah.
but somewhere in that time frame I read Hour of Decision, and that's also very easily digestible, I think, especially
Yeah.
for people of a right-wing political inclination, because his like colored revolution and the white revolution, this is all things that are very innate nowadays in a lot of right-wing streams of thoughts. So you don't really need a lot of Spenglerianism introduction when reading Hour of Decision.
Yeah.
So, and other than that, I read his what is it called? The books of his estate relatively late. I find Frühzeit der Weltgeschichte, like the not Urfragen, primal questions, but the other one, I find that relatively hard to digest, actually, because it's very, what do you call it? The structuring and the way he phrases, the questions he answers, essentially, is not as refined as in A Decline of the West or his other books, because these are raw notes, essentially, as far as I understand.
Interesting.
But
a bit
it's
like
still worth
niche.
reading.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I guess I'll hit you with the question then. Which one's your favorite work of his? If you had to pick one on a desert island.
Decline of the West, obviously.
Yeah. It's definitely his most complete work.
Yeah.
And you could probably derive almost every other work out of it if you tried hard enough. So I think it's probably the easy magnum opus.
Yeah.
I guess then the question is, if you are a dilettante, so a lot of people ask me specifically, how do I get into Decline of the West, or how do I get into Spengler? Because I think when you encounter philosophy for the first time, or if you're a bit of, as I said, a dilettante on it, you don't really know where to start when you start hearing different people mentioned and all these different concepts mentioned. What would be, I don't know, you could say a 101 on getting into Spengler?
Well, I don't think you need any. People sometimes say you need to read Goethe or Nietzsche first, but I don't think you need any sort of, what do you call it, like theory introduction.
No.
I was like 17 when I read Decline of the West, or 18, as I previously mentioned.
Yeah.
It's very innate to a lot of people, I think. There's a factor to it that not everyone kind of gets it.
Yep.
Not because they're not smart enough or not like cultured enough or whatever you want to call it, but because you needed to be a certain kind of person to get Spengler, essentially.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it's almost like a siren call, right? Like when you read it, you kind of like he's speaking directly to you.
Yes,
in that weird way.
He's similar to Nietzsche, I guess,
Yeah.
in some regard, because a lot of what Nietzsche wrote, like Will to Power and whatever, a lot of that is already very much part of the culture nowadays. It's, and you encounter it in movies and whatever.
Yeah.
It's very innate.
Yeah.
The kind of the way Nietzsche framed his philosophy and whatever, the kind of questions he asked. This is very innate. So when a normal person who's somewhat interested in these things reads Nietzsche, I go like, oh, okay, this is obvious. I've encountered this in my life previously.
Yeah.
And for some, Spengler is the same, I think, because a lot of his writing is also innate. The Eurocentrism that was prevalent at his time or before his time, that is not really that much prevalent anymore. The sort of relativism, when you say, oh, well, I guess a Spenglerian would say, Egyptian culture is essentially of the same worth, when you take a step back, as the Faustian culture.
Yeah.
But obviously, Faustian is of more worth than the Egyptian to us, because we are Faustian, we are of the Occident.
Yeah.
But that was not the prevalent mindset at the time, as far as I know. People were very much of the opinion that Europe is where history happens, and he talks about, he has a line in Decline of the West that the centuries, before us, they get compressed. The history in those, the happenings in those
Yeah.
centuries get compressed. But ever since Napoleon, I think Napoleon it is, or some other, ever since Luther, and then even more Napoleon, something like that, he says, the decades blossom up like ghosts or something like that. The line is something akin to that. So they get blown out of proportion, essentially. And I don't think that mindset is much prevalent in our time anymore.
No,
you have, yeah.
I was just saying you're exactly right. I think it's easy to equate this even with because I know he uses the analog of the Roman Empire, but if you look at even Roman Empire history from what most normal people would encounter, it's like, look, not much happens up until about 100 BC, and then a whole bunch of stuff happens, and then at 400 AD it collapses and dies.
Yeah. Which is obviously wrong,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just as much happened, at any time.
Yeah.
Whether it was, cultural civilization or at least a relatively large conglomerate of people.
Yeah.
As happened at other times.
Yes, and so it is super interesting to understand, like the why do we place importance on certain time periods rather than others, given that essentially we're doing the same things over and over again. So it is a very interesting proposition, because I think that's where Spengler is at his best, almost, is when he's being a historian, but not in a historian fashion.
Yes, exactly. And something that's interesting, I think, when you kind of reflect, or when at least for me, this applies, when I reflect upon my thinking of history, I think to myself, well, Napoleon seems as far back to me personally as Lenin. There's not really much, like I feel as much close to Napoleon in the sense of how I know about his person, what he did, what effect he had on the world, on my life, whatever, as Lenin. But obviously, the history gets blown out of proportion when you go like, 1914, and then the World War, and it's this big thing. But you don't really talk that much about, let's say, the Napoleonic Wars or the French Revolution. These things were just as big at that time. So sort of relativism is needed when you want to engage with history in a sort of Spenglerian lens, I would say.
Yeah, for sure. I completely agree. And I think that goes into even at the start of what you call the Gothic culture, was when, like, if you can imagine a crusade, which is like a call to arms across the entire Christian world. I mean, that had to be a massive event.
Yes, of course, yes.
Politically, if we equate it, it's like going to Iraq, in terms of having to get all these countries to say yes and then send their troops into all these things. So I think we definitely understate the totality of events from a practical perspective, and like you say, relating them to how we operate today. I think it's definitely worthwhile, and this is just for everyone else watching, is that if you aren't familiar with history, Spengler will get you familiar with history. I think it's always one of those things where just reading it will tell you a lot of the things that you would have been missing anyway.
Yes, and something to add maybe, which I recommend for everyone that hasn't read The Decline of the West, is when you read it, whatever you read a passage about Egyptian or Chinese history, and then he mentions some name, and oftentimes he mentions names and kind of presupposes that people already know about them, or time periods, which obviously most people don't. But the fun part of reading, or the fun about reading The Decline of the West, was for me also that you read it and then whatever, I don't know about this Chinese emperor, I'll look him up. I maybe order a book about him, or I watch videos about him. And so by reading, you sort of treat it like some people treat Wikipedia, where you click on a link and you click on another link and another link. So it's sort of like that.
Yeah. No, exactly. It's such a fascinating way. And because I think that his prism about how viewing history through the same growth and decline, and then you start to see the exact same patterns that he was seeing in Chinese culture and in Indic culture and in Egypt, Apollonian. And it really just strikes you as like, okay, we really are just living through this same exact process with different names and a different soul or spirit,
Yeah. And the striking similarities are often, I wouldn't say frightening, but they're eye-opening
Yeah.
when you, for example, read about the apartment houses in Rome, and
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
think that were so poorly constructed and they broke down, and then you walk through a modern city and you look at these ugly, cement houses, and you think yourself, this is the same thing.
Yeah. 100%. I think what really struck me was that the modern discourse now, a lot of it is around total fertility rate. And I know Elon Musk is a big total fertility rate guy. And then you go to Rome and you're like, okay, let's look. And then Augustus has all of these laws and rules about producing more Romans. And like,
Yeah,
unmarried women, they must get married if it's been 9 months, and that they, get tax breaks. And if they're under 40, they have to, have babies basically. And it's like, okay, so Rome literally went through the exact same discourse we're going through today in almost
yeah,
every shape and form. It's insane.
yeah. And I
Uh,
mean, I guess you could say we know the most about the Greco-Roman, the Apollonian
yeah,
culture, and Spengler also writes, I think, or makes the most comparisons between Greco-Roman and Faustian Occidental.
yeah,
And so I think Rome is always, or Greece is always a good comparison to draw. Sometimes, because even though if you actually get familiar with it, it is very alien to our life, to our mindset.
yeah.
But still, we know the most about it, so you can draw the most comparisons there compared to, let's say, Egypt or China, which I personally don't know a lot about, but these are very much different than our culture, you could say.
Yeah, no, it's a great point because, if you talk about time-wise, the Magian cultural period, which was stultified by Islam, is probably closer to us and probably had more documentation than Greco-Apollonian.
Yeah,
So, from that perspective, we still relate ourselves much closer to the Apollonian soul spirit, or like the time period, than we do the Magian one, even though it's closer to us time-wise.
yeah, yeah, that's correct. Yeah,
I guess the Mesoamerican one is even closer, but we know even less about that.
yeah, and it
So,
also the I guess you could say the knowledge about it is kind of perverted by the fact that a lot of, as far as I know, that is written about, accounts of the Mesoamerican culture was written by priests or missionaries,
mm,
Christians that were there, and they wrote out of their own perspective.
yeah.
So this gets filtered through like three lenses before it reaches you, and
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think that's almost one of his best points is that you'll never understand a soul culture because I think a lot of particularly the online, you could call them the right wingers, especially, they really like to harken back to like what was it to be a Grecian, Spartan, or be a Roman soldier, and then
yeah,
I always appreciate the fact that Spengler's like you will never understand. It doesn't matter how much you think you do, you just aren't that kind of person. It just is impossible for you.
yeah, exactly. And we are much closer in mindset to a Dominican monk in the 11th century
Yeah.
than Seneca or Augustus,
Yeah, yeah. It really makes you appreciate the Faustian soul, from that timeless or the transcendental perspective, like a spirit
Yes.
that's been able to carry us from the Teutonic forests 2,000 years later is exactly the same mind state that you can carry through.
Yeah.
I guess it's that blood memory or something like that.
Well,
Um,
I don't know if it's blood memory, but at least, it carries through, like you said, it's sort of transcendental.
Yeah, for sure. I think pivoting slightly though, it would be good if you maybe give your position on Prussianism. Now, obviously, you can just read Prussianism, socialism, but I think maybe your understanding of Prussianism and how we are drifting away from it would be quite interesting to hear.
Well, the I would say, maybe a different perspective than you, or a different view upon that topic, because I think Prussianism, the sort of mindset or the form of state, the worldview
Yeah,
that encapsulates, is essentially impossible nowadays, because Spengler said somewhere, I think it was in Hour of Decision or somewhere in another book, that there will be a war fought within Western civilization that will decide essentially the fate, the way which way of life will we orient ourselves around
yeah,
for the coming centuries. And obviously this war was in part World War I, but much more particularly World War II. And even though I don't think necessarily that the National Socialists and the Third Reich and Mussolini and whatever particularly encapsulate, Spengler's Prussianism to the core, they did obviously have more elements in it than the United States or England or France. And this war was lost by sort of side that represented Prussianism, and it was won by the piracy, robber capitalist side, essentially. The English, the Americans. The French and the Spanish and whatever, these you can essentially discount. They are irrelevant in this context. They have their own culture soul, I guess you could call it. He calls somewhere, I think, in Hour of Decision. No, it was in Prussianism and Socialism. He says that the French are like prone to anarchism, which is obviously very true when you look at any random event in French history.
Yeah.
And but I do think, coming back to my point, I think that Prussianism lost the Civil War, and it is essentially impossible to restructure it. Prussianism is sort of, to give a short explanation of how I view it, a meritocratic, fascistic state, very much compared to Mussolini's Italy. You can compare it to that. All within the state is something that you can apply to, and nothing outside of the state, as Mussolini says, is something you can apply to Prussianism. But I don't think that is possible anymore. The sort of hierarchies, the structures that would have made that possible, that existed, for example, in 1913 in Germany, they don't exist anymore. This was ripped out by the root. They dissolved the Prussian state. Every sort of bureaucratic structure that existed that made that possible is essentially gone. You can see remnants of this in Germany, where we call it Beamte, essentially employees of the state that have a special position. They don't really pay taxes like normal people do. For example, professors or, back in the day, mailmen were Beamten.
Okay.
Beamte. So that you can see remnants of this in Germany, but I do think that generally it is no longer possible to revive that, because you need structures for these kind of things, and these don't exist anymore for Prussianism. At least that's my opinion.
No, for sure. I think I agree. Just for context, for those of you listening, Spengler basically says that there's a differentiation between what is a money feeling and a rank feeling. So where you rank is more important, and he points to the fact that there are poor Junkers in Germany who had higher ranks than, say, a really wealthy merchant. So were respected more regardless of their ability to profit, wealth or buy things. And so this rank feeling was like the determinant of how your society is structured on how much you contribute, basically. And as you say, the meritocratic feeling of that determines your status, your social position, versus the Anglo, which is much more around how much money do you have and what can you buy.
Maybe I can interject here quickly.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you go.
To make another comparison to modern Germany, as I said, remnants of this exist, and you pointed to the rank distinction between money distinction.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, as I said, remnants of this exist. The professors, when you're a professor in Germany, you have or you do your PhD, I think is the English equivalent.
Yeah.
You have a doctor. For example, your name is Franz Meyer, and so it says Dr. Meyer. And then when the police stops you and, for example, checks you for driving with alcohol, they have, by law, they have to talk to you with doctor. They have to say Dr. Meyer. So this is a remnant of this, where, whatever, if Elon Musk was driving around in Germany, he wouldn't have that. So there's a specific sort of rank position that changes your position in the social hierarchy merely by being a doctor, by having done your PhD.
Yeah, which is a great example, actually. I think because you don't really have, well, I mean, you have the aristocracy legacy, but you don't really have an aristocrat anymore, right? Like you can carry the title of von or zu still,
Yeah.
but it doesn't bestow upon you any social credit, does it?
No, it doesn't. This is
No.
more. I mean, I had a girl in my class a few years ago when I was still in school,
Mm,
and she had von in her name,
mm.
and this is essentially irrelevant. It's like this makes you a bit more exotic, I guess. Makes you a bit more interesting, but it's
Yeah.
irrelevant. But if you have doctor in your name, you have an actual position of hierarchy.
Yeah. Okay. It's because like Dr. Angela Merkel carries more respect than just Angela Merkel, the master
Yeah,
chemist.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And is there any rank distinction between the type of doctorate, like if you're a MD or a legal doctor, or is it all similar?
Well, no, doctor is doctor.
Okay.
You did your just by the name of it always says doctor.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, sometimes it says Dr. Inc., for example, or Dr. Ing for like engineers, science. There's like different names for it. Obviously, the medical doctor is not called the same thing as a engineer or a
Mm,
biochemist,
yeah.
but nevertheless, the phrase of doctor, I think, is the same for all of these.
Yeah. Okay. And carries the same rank distinction or
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
status. Oh, that's very, I mean, that's super interesting. Is it at all the case that you have any political positions which carry? I know in the UK, for instance, you're the Right Honourable. So even if you're retired as a politician, you're still the Right Honourable ex-member of Parliament. So I mean, the Anglos do carry some distinction around service. Obviously, with Sir, being a knight or a member of the British Order or a member of the British Empire, MBE, MBO. Does Germany? I know they have obviously awards, but is there any significant distinction there?
For politicians?
Politicians or a bestowed rank. So if you have
Not
a
really.
Sir, no.
As far as I know, not. No.
No. Okay. Because I think that would be semi-equivalent in the English-speaking world, is that you can be a Sir. So in Australia, where I'm from, but then also in the UK or New Zealand, Commonwealth countries, you can still be granted Knight. So you could be Sir, your name, and then
Yes,
there are some distinctions though.
yes, I know of that. Yeah.
Which I think is also talking to the same thing, that there is this fusion of the spirit, because I think we like to say that the Teutonic soul was split in two, right? And you have the Viking and then you have the knightly spirits. And the knightly
Yeah.
spirit was the one which lost, as I said, the Great War. But I think, both still carry elements of each other. So it is interesting to see how they respond to each other, because it's, not the case that Anglos hate rank. It's more like Anglos are merit first, but rank still holds its place, with a special consideration. Usually it's earned, as they say, rather than given, which I think it sometimes feels like in the Prussian world, it was you were a Junker, therefore you are just better, you're born better.
Yeah, that is something that is true, and that is also part of why I think this sort of spirit of Prussianism can't be revived anymore, because this inheritance of the rank was a very intrinsic part of it. Because, for example, he speaks about, this is common knowledge, I think, how aristocratic families in Germany or other countries, they sacrificed proportionally a lot more of their sons in the wars than other normal middle class peasants. I think I don't know what the exact death toll was, but for example, in I think the Napoleonic Wars or in World War One, a lot of the Junker families, a lot of the lower aristocratic families that descended maybe from knightly houses, they sacrificed whatever 6 out of 10 sons for a war, and a normal family would sacrifice 2 out of 10. This is an intrinsic part of Spengler's vision of Prussianism, though he does point to the fact that non-aristocratic men should be led into the system. And he I don't know where it was, I think it was in Neubau des Deutschen Reiches, the reconstruction of the German Reich. He appeals to the German nobility after World War One to take up the responsibility to sort of teach their young sons to teach the general populace a specific way of life.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, because I guess you want to give the flower bed enough nutrients to grow the flowers, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes.
I do find it quite interesting because when you grow up, you don't really understand how powerful men used to be. But there were men who were just built for leadership, built for war, built in those ways. Whereas I think when you encounter most men nowadays, it's very dismal. You know, there's very few men with outstanding qualities like it seems was so prevalent historically. And that must
Yeah,
have to go into it, you know?
yeah. I'm not, to maybe interject, I'm not a monarchist or whatever, but
No.
there is a fact that the fact is that when you raise someone in a specific way for their whole life to be a leader, to know about strategy, to know about economics and whatever,
Yeah.
obviously that person is much more capable of a leading role than a normal person who gets raised on a farm or goes to a normal school like
Yeah.
anybody else. And there's an obvious distinction here.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I think the reason I'm not a monarchist is I think you look at any monarchy in Europe and you go, would anyone actually go into battle and die for that king or queen? And I think most of the people who care are old ladies who read the gossip magazines. So I think it's just very telling that historically kings led battles. I mentioned elsewhere, but I think Napoleon, who was emperor, was the general on the field in battle. He wasn't shooting a gun, but he was there. Versus, I think nowadays, most of the regents wouldn't even think of serving anything other than a notional, 2 to 5 years in the Navy or something like that, Air Force.
Yeah, I mean, what is the king's name of Great Britain right now?
Charles.
George? Charles.
Yeah.
Can you imagine Charles with his, I don't know, 80 years leading an army into battle, or at least shooting a gun or something? No, this is ridiculous.
No, exactly. Which I think is, and we say 80 years old is, really old and stuff. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure Frederick Barbarossa was 67 when he led the crusade.
I actually don't know that. I do know that he died down there.
Yeah, he was trying to swim and he got taken away by the currents or something like that. But he was definitely aged, and then even Charlemagne, right, all the way up until his death was leading armies. So I think it's just this you say, call it exhaustion maybe of the soul. The spirit is just so evident in our aristocracy that the idea of because I know Mencius Mollberger, what's his name, Curtis Yarvin, he's a big monarchist. But it's just a nonsensical term. And I think even Spengler says this, is the idea of monarchism is just irrelevant today. It doesn't mean what you think it means.
Yeah. I'm not particularly familiar with Mencius Mollberg,
No.
but I think his position is more of a stronger executive.
Yeah, he's of the CEO type.
Yeah, and so that would be in line, I guess, with some of the things that Spengler said, but monarchism in and of itself, the traditional monarchism, is obviously ridiculous in today's age.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think what he's really trying to say is a diluted version of Caesarism, and whether he's trying to imbue it with his own messaging to make it seem like he's very intellectual or something. But it's just obviously a very poor derivative of the idea of a Caesar. Which I think is the age that we're in. I guess I personally make quite a lot of videos now on Trump as a Caesar type. I don't know, what would you feel as if you had to represent Trump as?
I mean, I don't think Trump is a Caesar. I equate him more of there was a Roman that lived shortly before Caesar or at the same time.
The Gracchi brothers.
Crassus, I think his name was.
Okay.
No?
Yeah, so there were the Gracchus brothers who did the revolts, and they were both murdered. And then there was Sulla, who was the first Caesar, as denoted by Spengler.
I mean, wasn't there this really rich guy that bought up houses that burned down? I don't remember his name.
Yeah.
So I equate Trump with sort of a very much Caesarian figure.
Yeah.
I guess in the time frame we are around about 50 BC right now, if you compare it directly to the Roman era.
Yeah, I think Sulla was 87, and is in 87 BC, and I think he was Spengler's first Caesar type.
Yeah, so we are entering that age, but personally, I don't think Trump is a Caesarian type. I would much more equate, for example, Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk with the sort of Caesarian types that we will see in our culture.
Yeah. No, I think it's very interesting because the form and shape is obviously going to be very different. And we think of Caesars, we think of, once again, guys, generals usually at the early stages who led their men to battle, all the way up to, I'm going to say, this 1st or 2nd century AD. Most of the Caesars were still going into battle as generals or leading an army, ostensibly. Whereas obviously Donald Trump was not even he's in the cadets, I think. But
I mean, he didn't go to Vietnam, I think.
Right? No, yeah, exactly. I can't blame him for that one, to be honest. I'm not sure I would have signed up for Vietnam, but...
No, I don't think I would have either, but I think Julian the Apostate was later than 200 AD, and he also went into battle.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect point. I guess you can see the militarization of the Roman Empire versus the Americans, where I think there is an emphasis on military, but you can see it now much more transformed probably, and this goes into techniques as a technology empire.
Yes.
The focus being, like you said, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are technology figures first and foremost. The money comes downstream of the technology.
Yes, exactly.
But so I definitely think that in the next 20 or 30 years, there'll be a Caesar for sure. But it'll be very interesting to see how much of a distance it is between the military type Caesar and the more cyber AI tech Caesar.
Yeah, I view it as sort of, I mean, I don't know, obviously, but I view the Occidental, the Faustian Caesar as sort of a mix between Cecil Rhodes, Elon Musk, and, robber barons, whatever, Jeff Bezos, sort of an amalgamation of all of those figures, of all of those characteristics.
Yeah, which is very interesting, right? Because I think one of the defining traits of a Caesar was that they were kind of had their own army, or at least their own followers. So it's not enough to belong to a political party or a family per se, but you much more had to be the person that everyone would follow, which is going to be interesting to see how many people are willing to die, in that way for a political figure. Because I think you'll find in America people willing to die for Donald Trump, regardless of the merits of that. I think there are enough hardcore MAGA hats, willing to go, yeah, I'll take a bullet for DT.
Yeah, yeah.
So it would be interesting because I think with Elon, I'm not sure he's cordial or likable enough. You know what I mean? I feel like he's very polarizing as a personality.
Yeah, no, I don't think he is a Caesar either. He's a dork. But
yeah, that's a very nice way of putting it. He is a dork.
But he has a lot of the characteristics that I think the Faustian Caesars will have, because he doesn't care about money. And a big part of Caesarism is the victory of blood, of power over money. And for example, someone like, what is his name? The Bill Gates would also not be a Caesar, because obviously he cares about money. He shorted the Tesla stock or some shit like that.
Yep.
A Caesar wouldn't care about money. He would, maybe the Faustian Caesar cares about technology, the machine first and foremost.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, it's a great point, because I think he calls them men of fact. And that's maybe where you see the difference, is that Bill Gates is not a man of fact. He's a man of ideals at the ultimate. Everything he's doing in his life is money towards an ideal of something, eliminating world hunger, eliminating blah, blah, blah. Whereas obviously, clearly, Elon's like, what facts can I do? Which extends all the way to him, IVF impregnating 15 women now, or whatever it is, with his sons. But these are all facts, right? These are just things he understands as a reality. If you want babies, use IVF, and you can have as many babies as women will carry.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously also Elon Musk, which is one of the characteristics that I would equate to Caesarism. He doesn't care about money only insofar as it can serve his primary goal, which I think is, he says this plenty of times, an interplanetary species.
Yeah. Yep.
And if you look at essentially every single one of the companies that he's leading or that he's part of right now works towards that goal.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it's not even an ideal, it's almost a goal. It's a very much an objective. So the aspirational, it sounds idyllic, but it's actually a reality you can conjure, you can create it.
Yeah, it's a very concrete goal. It's not eliminating world hunger. It's putting humans on Mars. This is a very concrete goal.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I think we're always blessed. I mean, I'm happy we're lucky enough to actually have had a Spengler type figure, because it would have been very difficult to disentangle all of these themes without someone to give you the groundwork. It feels almost lazy, but you relate almost everything in my life and politically and whatever back to how Spengler viewed or gave the prism for viewing Faustian culture.
Yeah,
so
I agree.
We're very blessed. So if you haven't read Spengler, this is your opportunity to join the club. It is very difficult though if you don't feel the life feeling, and I think this is why my channel was obviously handicapped from the start. Is trying to speak to the Gothic soul means you're probably capped at having maybe 100,000, 200,000 men across the Occident.
Yeah,
I'd be surprised if it's more than that.
No, probably fewer.
Yeah, which is a shame in some ways, but obviously great men require the filtration process, the suffering, as Nietzsche called it.
Yeah, and Spengler says this himself when he says somewhere that this, Decline of the West is not written for the masses; it is written for a select few people.
Yeah, which makes you feel special, all warm inside, huh?
Yeah,
I'm one of those special people. He wrote it for me. No, I definitely think, and it's emblematic, and I think a lot of people view Occident or the West as like this collective, or that we're all Gothic, and you go to this is particularly true for America. Like you go there and you're like, oh no, it's all the white people that live here, but it becomes very evident, particularly with America, that there's not the one Gothic soul. They're not all the Anglo-Teutonic type, because you have Poles, you have Italians, you have any number of Eastern Euroslavs who have migrated there and integrated very well, but obviously just very clearly don't have that infinite will to power. You can almost see it in bearing out and how they do things. And I've maybe talked about this a little bit before, but like in Silicon Valley, for instance, it's a huge brain drain source. They like the brains around the world go there and are magnetized to it. But there's very few men of greatness coming out. If you had as many, they maybe have 1 million guys with an IQ above 150, and we know like 3 of them by name.
Yeah.
Which is outrageous, right? You look at almost any other time in history, and you could point to, say, like a gathering like that. And I think it was in Vienna. There was like 6 or 7 people we now know, including Hitler. But it's like at that time period, like Lenin, and I think Wittgenstein was there at the time.
Yeah.
So I think it's emblematic at least.
I mean, and also something about like great men. If you, for example, look at the Dominican friars of the Roger Bacon kind of people, the Albertus Magnus of the 13th, 14th century, these people are much more, they stand out more, because when you had an inclination towards such a path at that time, you went to the monastery, you went to some order, and there you could rise through up the ranks. You could actually fully employ that inclination, that maybe talent.
Yeah.
But nowadays, if you have an inclination towards, or maybe inclination is the wrong word, but if you have the capacity towards such a thing, you go into finance and you make a bunch of money that way, and then you retire with 40, or like the Mac, what is his name? Mark Andreessen.
Yes.
The relatively smart man, I would say, and doesn't say a lot of stupid things, but still someone like him would have been, Albertus Magnus in the 13th century. But now he goes into venture capitalism. So obviously these fields suck up all the talented, the capable people.
Yeah, it's actually a really good segue to the question I was going to ask you. And I already know the answer, but I still want to hear you explain it. Do you think Germany will ever create another Bismarck?
No, no way.
No.
I think Bismarck was a very solitary figure, because he had how do I explain this? In my view, he had a very unique capability to settle domestic affairs with foreign affairs and vice versa, and to sort of play people out against each other. Probably had a very high IQ, whatever that is worth. But I don't think someone like that would enter politics in today's age.
Yep.
As I mentioned, I think if a person like this, of a high IQ, of high capability existed in this age, he would probably become an engineer, a venture capitalist.
Yeah.
And on the other side, I also think the structure, the system that exists in Germany nowadays for the political parties don't allow for someone like that to rise, because it is very dependent on the parties. For example, the typical career path of a politician is you join the youth organization of, let's take the CDU, the mainstream conservative in parentheses party. You join the CDU as a 16-year-old for the youth organization.
Yeah.
And then you work in the youth organization for whatever, a few years. Then you become the secretary of whatever, a member of of a regional parliament of a state.
Yeah.
And then eventually you become the upper secretary or whatever with 30. And then you get written on the list to become a candidate for whatever, the parliament regional of Bavaria.
Yeah.
Which would be the CSU, but whatever. And then later you get written on the list, if you've been there for a few years, for the parliament in Berlin. So this is very much dependent on these party structures. And obviously you're not going to allow one person to rise up the CDU, up the SPD, whatever, that is very dominant, that has a capability to enact dominion upon other politicians, upon others, because this threatens the party structure, the party organization.
Yeah, okay. And I guess the question follows then, you're seeing the continuation of German politics as is then for the next 100 years?
How do I view it?
Well, yeah, as in is the structure. So to me, Germany is now more or less a client state in the way that America has its military bases on German soil. It dictates most foreign policy when it's material in its differences. So how would you view the political structure? Because I assume America probably wants to keep status quo. They don't want a disruptive EU for any reason.
No, I think well, there's a lot of things you can wish for as a German, as a European, as an American. Yeah. You can wish for things, but I think the reality is that after 45, after the Second World War, a Germany that acts self-aware, that acts in its own interest, as in the sense of realpolitik, in the sense of foreign policy, domestic policy, is not possible anymore. Because if Germany, for example, would go, okay, you know what, we actually own the EU, we pay the most in, we basically subsidize everybody except France and the Benelux states.
Yeah.
We're going to dictate terms now, In part, we do that because we have whatever, how many members, and Ursula von der Leyen is, in a high position.
Yeah.
But we don't really do that. We don't act in our self-interest. These are bureaucrats in the EU that dictate that. Whether they're German or not is irrelevant, in my opinion.
Yeah. But it's a good point.
Yeah, I do think, as I said, this is essentially impossible. Because if a Germany in today's age were to act self-aware, were to act in its own interest, raw political power-wise, there would be a very palpable reaction from foreign countries. They would not stand for that. You have already Poland is constantly shitting on us in whatever way.
Yeah,
they say things like, I don't know which one it was maybe the foreign minister or some Polish politician, when whoever blew up Nord Stream, he posted on X, "Thank you, USA," or something like that, with a picture of the bubbles in the North Sea.
Yeah.
So and the French are not going to allow us to become politically dominant. Right now, in my opinion, the French are dominating much of the EU, much of the foreign policy of the European countries.
Yeah.
So I think this is essentially impossible. So the role as a client state, in my opinion, cannot be abolished.
No.
Client state of the US. And when you're already set, this is my opinion now, when you're already set on a role, you might as well embrace it to the fullest extent.
Yeah.
So if, for example, Poland, they constantly beg the US to build military points in their country and to station nuclear rockets in their country. That sort of behavior, this is my opinion now, I don't know whether or not this will be embraced by the German politicians, but that sort of behavior, in my opinion, ought to be embraced, because you cannot, Germany in and of itself cannot act self-sufficient. So you have to use the umbrella of the United States. You have to use the system of NATO, of whatever, of these organizations of the UN, in the sense of that you sort of direct the US in specific ways by offering concessions or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Because I think for me, I always relate. I don't know how avid a reader you are of Carl Schmitt.
I read a few things by him, but I'm not really that well versed in him.
No, that's fine. There's a basic premise that he has, though, is that and I think even Spengler maybe mirrors this, is that the existence of internal policy or domestic politics is really just so that you do have an external or international politics. It's how do we have a society that's able to collectivize itself in a way that projects power externally so that it can get what it wants, which is super fascinating, because when you look at almost all modern European politics, which is where we live, they're all geared towards what does America let us do? It's, and then so there's I think domestic policy is fine, but when it comes to international politics, I think there's not a single European country that's actually dictated any external, I would say, goal or measure or anything like that, except maybe France in its ex-colonial territories like Mali, or I think the last time there was you could say, by their own volition, the France and the UK tried to seize the Suez Canal, I think in the 60s, and America told them to go fuck themselves. So yeah. I think for me, it's very almost sad, a country, like an entire region with such deep history. And I'm sure this is how the Greeks felt when Rome just dictated all the terms all the time during their possession. But it does feel very sad. You have such a rich history and all these amazing, powerful men and people who've come out and art and all this creation, and now it's just like, oh no, now you're an American suzerainty. You do what they say.
But that it is sad.
Yeah.
From the perspective of a European or someone who places importance in that culture and that region, but it is the reality. And I often think to myself when people say like, "Oh, we need a self-sufficient EU, we need to." United States of Europe or whatever, which, is like sounds like a good idea. But I think to myself, what use would have been a self-sufficient Greek in 0, or like 30 AD? What use would have that been?
No. Exactly.
So what does a Greek man born in whatever Thessaloniki, Athens, I don't fucking care. What does he do in 50 AD if he wants to be important? He goes to Rome.
Yeah, he signs up to be a legionnaire.
he signs up to be a legionnaire, or he works for the Roman state, for the Roman Empire in some sort of fashion. And that, I think, must be embodied. I don't know if that will be embodied, but this is my personal opinion. That is the path forward in any sort of, if you want as a European to have any sort of semblance of importance, of way to dictate history. Yeah,
for sure. I think that's probably the way to go about it. If there is a recommendation, it's that, you find an American wife and move there, have the kid and hope that the kid can become president. Because it's worthless otherwise trying to fix your country in a lot of ways, because you don't really have that control anymore. You're just governed by an external force for all intents and purposes.
And
I think it's, go.
This also can be equated, for example, to the Yugoslavian, civil war, or to the breakup of the Russian state. I do understand these people. I understand the Finnish, the Lithuanians, whatever. They didn't want to be controlled by the Russians, or the Croats, or the Bosnians didn't want to be genocided by the Serbs, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But still, you are in a structure that has much more force externally to benefit your people if you stay, for example, in the Yugoslavian country, in the Soviet Empire, than if you become whatever, Georgia, which is a random country and has essentially no power at all.
Yeah, fully agreed. Yeah, I think that also comes into the other Schmittian idea of allies and enemies. So like ultimately, if you reduce, your team and you look and you say, are they my ally in the extreme? Because I think Schmitt loves the extreme because it kind of highlights the rules. So in the extreme, like, are they the ally or the enemy? And then if you're in the ally, then how much power do you have? And which is why it's always so funny to listen to so much chatter around the Israel-Palestine conflict, because it's very clear, like one side has America, one side doesn't. So the conclusion here is automatic. It's not even worth discussing. Like,
Exactly.
it's just a pointless topic, and like the fact that it's in the news so much is it's obscene to me. I just don't care. I'm like, I already know what the outcome is, so why are you talking about it so much?
Yeah, exactly.
Which I think is just emblematic once again of that Spenglerian point of view, which is, if it's an American empire, it's this Anglo-Gothic soul spirit. The next thing we should be thinking about is getting to the moon and how many colonized planets we can make, rather than who gives a shit about feeding the entire third world like Bill Gates does.
Yeah. I mean, but that is a different point. But I agree completely. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, it's probably we'll call it morphologically the same point, but different topics under the hyponym. I think.
And I
Yeah.
think, sorry to interrupt, but I think Schmitt has another quote where he says, "Suzerain is he who decides the exception.
Yeah, sovereign. Yep.
Sovereign is he who decides the exception." Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, well, if you take, for example, foreign policy, if you take the how foreign policy is conducted within the world, within the Occident, well, who decides the exception? It's obviously
Yeah.
the United States.
Yeah.
There might be some differentiations. Some people, I think, like Bronze Age Herbert was it, who
Mm.
said that the Europeans sort of were the primary reason why the Ukraine war happened, and they sort of dragged the US into it.
Yep.
Whatever this might be correct or not, but generally the exception is decided by the United States, by the policymakers in the United States. So if you want to decide the exception as well, you somehow need to be part of that club.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. And I think even more explicitly, it's like the president is the sovereign. Because almost all international politics is done out of the president's office, and we saw how incapable someone like Joe Biden is because he's got dementia. That foreign policy was very weird. It was all just random or no decisions, or so you could clearly see there were divergent interests where one person is not making all these random decisions. But with Trump, it's very clear. It's like, these are the things I want. Marco Rubio, go out and do those things. And rightly or wrongly, he's making the decisions, and everyone else just lumps it. It's you just get used to whatever he wants.
Yeah, this is also why I think any sort of like posturing by the European states, oh, we will increase defense spending to be more self-sufficient. Ridiculous, because whether or not you spend $300 billion on your army or not is, first off, it gets sucked up by the bureaucratic state, by the bureaucratic parasites.
Yeah.
For example, in Germany, they want to increase the defense spending. I don't know to what percent, I think almost to 5, something like that. Recently, the new chancellor said he wants to be he wants the German army to be the strongest on the continent.
Okay. Interesting.
But they had like whatever, they have $100 billion that goes to cybersecurity, and that essentially means random NGOs, that are under that umbrella, that are defined under that umbrella. So in that definition, it's useless, and also in the definition that even if you have a strong army, you're not going to do anything with it.
Yeah, and I think that also raises the question for me. I guess this is, maybe I can direct it to you. Is a recent surveys in the UK showed not many young men are willing to sign up to die for their country. Germany had a huge influx of immigrants, obviously, since 2016. So you have two types of young men now. You have German young men, and then you have foreign young men. And what percentage of either of those will want to sign up to die for Germany as it stands?
I don't know. Possibly there are studies on this, but I don't know the percentages, the exact ones. But I think neither of those two groups are very much inclined to do that.
No,
neither
exactly.
Neither the Germans nor the new immigrants are inclined to do that. To make a sort of a larger point out of this, the recent years, ever since the influx of the immigrants, since 2016, I think it was, or 2018, almost 300,000 people have left Germany, have emigrated from Germany every year. So that's around 3 million in total the last few years. And of those, I think 75% are academics.
Wow.
So they studied at university.
Yeah.
And also 63% of the whole 3 million or whatever, how many millions it is, are from 25 to 30.
Wow.
So the people that, you know, maybe obviously the normal soldier isn't an academic, but nevertheless, the point still stands that, you know, a capable young German man or woman, they would rather leave than stay here and serve the country in whatever fashion that is.
Yeah, I mean, it is very catastrophic. And I think particularly with the historical legacy of German militarism is, you know, 1,000 years of fighting the forces of evil, basically. And I think this is why Spengler called Germany's the ultimate battleground, right? The last gasp of the Faustian man. It has to happen in Germany. It's fairly horrific to think that young men like you and I, well, youngish men like you and I, wouldn't sign up to defend your country in that way. But given the proposition, it doesn't feel like a very good deal. You know, you don't go in with the mind around glory and faith and belief in the spirit of Germania. You go in with, no, there's a bureaucrat going to send you into a Ukrainian trench to get droned by some Russian 17-year-old, you know?
Yeah, and also the German military tradition is essentially dead. This doesn't exist anymore. No. Nowadays, I don't know the exact rules, but I think if you become a soldier, you can basically say, "Oh, I don't want to go to that zone," you know.
Okay.
I don't want to go to Afghanistan or whatever. So a lot of this is sort of a system to for people that don't really know what to do.
Yeah.
So they just go to the Bundeswehr. They do Grundausbildung, like an elementary training for 2 years or whatever, and then they maybe join the bureaucratic force. So they go to Mali and then guard random, military stations there. So this isn't really the same spirit that fought World War I or World War II or whatever, the Napoleonic War. That doesn't exist anymore. This tradition was ripped from us. There's nothing keeping. There's no link between those two armies or those multiple armies, essentially.
Yeah, which is mental. So for everyone else, you and I obviously both know this, but for everyone else listening, it's to say that you had what was Prussia had 75% of its GDP at some point being spent on the military. With Frederick the Great saying he was the first servant of the state, in that, you know, everyone else, the only reason you're here is because you're serving the state for its whims and purposes. To everyone leaving Germany, and the only people signing up for the army are those with no other prospects. And this only happened in 200 years, right?
Yeah, and there was the Prussian sort of militarism, it is often called.
Yeah.
It reached very deep into society. There was, I don't remember when this specifically was. I think this was during Frederick the Great's time.
Yeah.
Where military uniforms were so abundant that normal people would wear them like randomly, or it was just very much a part of life. You had, I think, a very long, 3-5 years of mandatory service.
Yeah.
This reached very deep into society. It was not just whatever, you have a large army. This sort of had its fingers, the army in parentheses had its fingers in every aspect of society.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic point. I think you can trace the elements of this to, like, in England, the outfit, you know, the gentlemanly attire was the suit, which was like a hunting suit, basically out of the Scotland forest. You would go hunting in your tweed suit. But in continental Europe, it was the military uniform. You know, everyone, like you said, from civil servant to ex-military to current government politician would wear basically a uniform, like a military uniform.
Yeah.
Whereas nowadays, I don't think you see anyone in a military uniform. except in Germany, if you want to get a free train ride, you probably wear the camouflage.
Yeah, exactly. And the point also stands that back in the day, these people were respected. When you saw someone in a military uniform,
Yep.
you had immediate respect for them.
Yep.
Sort of like the point I made with the doctor. Some people,
Yes.
they sneer at the doctor thing and to go like, oh, he thinks he's important. But still, that carries more importance in today's Germany than a military uniform. When you see a guy on the train with a military uniform, you kind of most people would sort of like look down upon him and think like, oh, okay, yeah, you're wearing your shit to get a free train ride, or this sort of sentiment.
Yeah.
Obviously, some, whatever more patriotic parts you can call it, do have respect for that, but in general, this is non-existent.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm laughing, but it is extremely disappointing and very black-pilling, in that way. To say, how do you go from such heights to such lows so quickly?
Yeah.
Because I think even in America, you still have some tradition around, if a soldier is wearing a uniform to the general day-to-day, there's a certain level of respect. And this is seen more in the Midwest and the South than it is in California or New York. But there is a tradition, of free, good, like if you're at the Chipotle, you get a free burrito or something, if you're wearing a uniform, or like they still have some respect to veterans.
Yeah, or like I think it is. I don't know. I've not been long in the US. I've been there for like 2 weeks, once on a vacation. But I think it is tradition there to say thank you for your service, something like that.
Yep.
But that doesn't exist in Germany, or I don't think it exists in Austria either.
No, not even in the UK or anywhere I've been. It's just seen as a bit of a funny thing of like, why would I do that?
Yeah.
And that probably goes worse and worse for the wars that we can remember, at least in our lifetime, which is like Afghanistan and Iraq. So you go, okay, well, am I thanking you for bombing random Middle Easterners? Probably not. Whereas I think traditionally it's more seen as like your duty to your country, and we should be thanking you for, if we are invaded, you're going to be the one on the front line shoving a bayonet down someone's throat. But yeah, so I think this is probably where it comes into this idea of Spenglerian pessimism, is that because of the decline, which you're seeing in real time, it does imbue you with a certain disposition, and that usually is negative in a lot of ways. It's looking back and going, wow, we were so glorious and powerful, and now we just exist at America's whims. So, I mean, maybe you can go into it a bit personally, how you try to embody what I call Spengler's realism rather than his pessimism or his optimism.
Well, he calls, I don't know if he coined that term, but there is the term brave pessimism.
Okay.
Which you know how bleak the situation is. You know how, what you called former glory. The stories of the monasteries and you see the Gothic cathedrals. The stories of Frederick the Great, Napoleon, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And that is not possible anymore.
Yeah.
That Spengler in one line in The Decline of the West says, why write another poem or another philosophy of the mind?
Yeah.
These things have been said 100 times already.
Yeah.
Often
if I can just quickly interject with a personal anecdote. I was like super interested in doing my PhD or like a JD, a Juris Doctor in law. And I was looking at options like Cambridge and Oxford. And I'd reading Spengler's Decline of the West at the time. And he was like, we don't need any more philosophers. We don't need any more bookish academics. We don't need any of these people. We need engineers and we need business people. And that's it.
Yeah,
I was like,
exactly.
Okay, I'm going to give up those hopes and dreams, because he makes an excellent point. I'm just going to quit that kind of, mirage delusion.
Exactly. And I think, he goes on later to say, why write another poem, another philosophy of the mind, or whatever he calls it.
Yeah.
Instead, we should construct another aerial engine.
Yeah.
And, the engineer as the priest of the machine, he later says in the chapter on the machine in the second volume.
Yeah.
And so I think pessimism in the Spenglerian sense doesn't mean, I'm like depressed, there's nothing to do, black pilling. It means acknowledging the reality of your personal situation. Where are you born? What sort of life is possible for you? in another point, I don't know if this is in Decline of the West or in his personal diary notes, he says, you have to realize you can't be a soldier, a businessman, an engineer, a poet, all of these things. You can't be a farmer. You can't be all of these things together. You have to settle on a path that is possible, essentially, in our times, that is still worthwhile in our times, meaning it is not worthwhile to write, whatever, philosophy of the will or something like that, because this has already been said and written by better men, by more capable men. And so what you should do, or what one should do in the Spenglerian sense, is instead what can be done, and then try to sort of channel the creative, the energies that you have in that field. For example, become an engineer, manufacture new plane engines, new chips, design new computers, write script for AI or whatever. These are things that still can be done, that haven't been done yet.
Yep. No, I think it's an excellent point, and that is the way you should probably, if you've not already, frame your life. I think for me, like, it's very evident because you and I probably both spend too much time online. But in the online sphere, there's a lot of these different types, because you have men who are attracted to the idea of power, infinite will to power philosophy, just as a general life feeling, or Weltanschauung. But the biggest example I can see of that is someone like Peter Thiel, who went straight into, how do I build massive companies, and then out of my wealth now, how do I have political action, political change? Versus, and I think there's a common trope here on the right hand side, maybe we alluded to earlier, of punditry and of commentary. So like, there's a lot of guys who write Substacks, or they have their Twitter accounts, and they have even like me, like a YouTube channel, and they speak on all these topics, but they don't really do anything with it. There's no political purpose to it other than just doing it. You know what I mean? Which is why I much prefer the Peter Thiel, like, do things and then afterwards do more things, versus doing something that doesn't really have an end.
Have a constructive goal.
Right.
For example, when you look at a Gothic cathedral nowadays in whatever Europe, a lot of these cannot be built anymore because people don't know how to do it. I know someone who was involved with the reconstruction of the big church in Dresden that got like firebombed, and then after the reunification, they sort of reconstructed it. And they had if I remember correctly, he told me that for the church bells, they had to get a father and son duo from, I think, southern Switzerland, because no one else knew how to do it correctly. So these sort of venues of maybe artistic or philosophical paths are, in my opinion, they're closed off, because, for example, on the one side, they have already been said to the full extent, they've already been explored. And on the other hand, you don't really know how to do it anymore. Like, there's for example, Rembrandt or whatever, these capable masters of the arts. These were very capable people, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, whatever. These were very capable people that trained this for their whole life. And if you say, oh, I want to paint now, it's just going to be shoddy work anyway.
Yeah. I think Spengler uses the example of the fugue. That, it's impossible to write these anymore. They don't know how.
Yeah, exactly.
The 19th century, no one knew how to write a fugue anymore.
And I mean, if you talk about the fugue, Bach, for example, he wrote a composition every week, multiple times, sometimes a week. He did like multiple compositions every week for several churches. Imagine that nowadays. If you stack all the Bach works above another, the notes, it's a man's height.
Yeah, it's unreal. Like, it's I think it's unfathomable, honestly. Like, it's not possible for anyone in the modern age to understand how exactly talented this guy was and how prodigious a worker is.
So, for the listeners maybe that are interested in the sort of pessimism question, Spengler wrote an essay on this called Pessimism ? where he was exactly like talking about this question and answering it, because people accused him after he released Decline of the West, after it was published, of being a pessimist, in the traditional sense.
Yes, exactly. A bit like his
But
socialism, people accuse you of being a socialist and you go, I am a socialist.
Yeah,
not
exactly.
not the way you think it is.
Yeah. So these, I think, who was it? Oswald Mosley, who, said a lot of things I don't agree with, but he had one line where he said, I think, that he's like glad to live in this time and age because there are so many things to do.
Yeah.
So this is the sort of pessimism that must be
embraced,
that must be made intrinsic when reading Spengler. There's so many things to do, but you just have to realize what are those things that you can still do.
Yeah. No, it's a fantastic point. I think this is for me why Spengler has such a good. It's not his metaphysics, but the way he outlines it, obviously, is that there's, as I say, intrinsic in us is the Gothic spirit, and you really have to embrace it. It's a waste to not, to pretend, and I say this a lot, but to wish you were a knight in the 1200s or a Viking in the 900s. It's like, this isn't going to happen. So you utilize the same spirit that you have in a way that actually is beneficial, and you can channel it to be, whatever your version of greatness actually can be.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
It was like, what would you want to tell your ancestors? I think that's always the nicest part in a thought experiment. It's like, would they be proud of who you are, given that they, made you come here, equipped you with all their genetics and all the Gothic soul spirit, and what are you going to do? You're going to play Dota online all day, sit in your basement. I was like, or are you going to go out and actually try and do something?
Yeah, I do think that it is okay to have a YouTube channel as you do, or to talk on Twitter. There's nothing per se wrong with that.
No.
But you must realize that that is not, that can't be your main thing, sort of,
Yes.
That can't be. Yeah.
Exactly point. I think that's what goes into it for, you have the right sphere, like I think BAP, Bronze's Pervert and those people, is I don't not appreciate them. I did a video even on Carl Benjamin. It's not that I don't appreciate that you talk about topics in certain ways. It's that I don't appreciate if you do amass a following, you do nothing with it.
Yeah, I do. I think like people like whatever BAP or some of these capable right-wing influencers or commentators, if you want to call them, they are worthwhile to listen to. They sort of they make you, they provoke thoughts in you. They make you think about things differently. And whatever these people do in their private life might be something different, but it this has no, most of the time, sometimes these people are listened to by actually important people, maybe, or policymakers, but most of the time this has no real world consequence. So if it can't be applied, if it doesn't affect the real world, it sort of diminishes its meaning in my mind.
Yeah, no, fully agree. And this is why I'll go back to it, but this is why I think Peter Thiel is probably an exemplar, because he is familiar, or he read Spengler's Decline of the West, and I think he probably agreed with quite a lot of it, given his the way his life's turned out.
Yeah.
I'm being kicked out of this this video recording, so I will have to cut it here, Fatum, unfortunately. But we can always do a follow-up, part 2 or part 3, seeing how you feel, because I think it's been a super nice chat with you. But otherwise, you can sign off if you want to leave the viewers with one thought of yours. It's always nice.
Well, as I previously mentioned in the beginning, I suggest if anyone hasn't read Spengler, start with Men and Technics, and then maybe Decline of the West, and then work your way forward. And I recommend reading him, because almost everything that happens in our age, he foresaw. He can explain in ways you couldn't possibly explain it yourself. So it is really worthwhile. It's not just philosophy or history that you're reading. It's sort of deepening your already intrinsic worldview.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it. Yeah, he's the modern day Nostradamus, but real rather than mythologized.
Okay, yeah.
Thanks for that, Fatum. Enjoy, buddy.
Thank you. Bye. Have a good day.